Last week, I called my parents and invited them to dinner at my place. I had just received my first big paycheck and wanted to celebrate this achievement by doing something special for them, a gesture to show them my gratitude and love. After dinner, I planned to surprise them with tickets to a luxurious 5-star resort, a fully paid 3-day trip where they wouldn't have to spend a penny. I wanted the three of us to enjoy this gift. It was the result of all my effort. It was my way of saying, I made it and I want to share this moment with you. When my parents arrived for dinner, I was excited to show them my home and tell them more about my job. But from the moment they walked in, their attitude made it clear they weren't impressed. First, they looked suspiciously around the apartment and kept asking if I really lived there. Then, when I finally convinced them that this was my home, my father started snooping around like a detective, opening drawers, checking behind the furniture, and even looking under the sink. He asked me several times if I had drugs hidden somewhere, as if he couldn't believe I was actually clean now that I was living alone and unsupervised. To give context, I'm the black sheep of my family. I'm the son who made the grave mistake of getting involved with drugs during high school. This decision led me to a dark and painful stage in my life where I had to attend rehab to recover. Now, I recognize how much suffering I caused my parents during that time. They've told me on several occasions how my actions brought shame to the family's reputation back then. Hearing those words hurt, but I understand why they felt that way. One of the most shameful acts I committed, something I deeply regret, was stealing money from my own mother just to buy more drugs. That betrayal of her trust still weighs heavily on me. If I could go back in time, I would give anything to avoid behaving that way. I fully assume responsibility for my decisions and the pain I caused my parents during those difficult years. However, I have worked very hard to change my life. Did my father really think so little of me as to believe that I was still using drugs, even after assuring them over and over that I had left those habits behind? Even at the table, when I mentioned my first paycheck and told them how proud I was of my new job, my mother ruined the moment with a cruel joke. She said, "More money means more drugs for you, doesn't it?" My father found this hilarious and started laughing along with her. I stood there feeling humiliated and hurt, trying to process what more I could say to make them believe me. I asked them directly why they kept bringing up my past, why they couldn't leave it behind and simply see the person I am now. My father didn't hesitate to answer and said, "People never change. No matter how brilliant your job or how much money you earn, to me, you're still an addict." He then launched into a monologue about all the money he had spent on me throughout the years, presenting me as a burden to him, and how he had spent even more by sending me to rehab. He argued that if I was really earning as much as I said, the least I could do was start paying him back all the money. I was stunned by the cruelty of his words. I replied, reminding him that I was very young when I made those mistakes and that I was going through grief back then. I told him how much I had strived to rebuild my life since then, and that it wasn't fair for them to keep throwing my past in my face whenever they felt like it. I expected understanding, or at least a moment of reflection from them. But instead, my mother looked me straight in the eyes and with a mocking smile said, "Once a black sheep, always a black sheep." Hearing that was a direct blow to the heart. I felt like all my effort, all my attempts to prove who I am now meant nothing to them. I had hoped this dinner would be a step towards reconciliation, a chance for them to see who I had become. But instead, I felt they were determined to keep me trapped in a version of myself that no longer existed. At that moment, I realized how much weight I had carried for years trying to earn their approval, only to realize that no matter what I did, in their eyes, I would always be a disappointment. I know I caused them pain during those difficult years when I was younger, and I have taken responsibility for my actions time and time again. But the fact that they keep bringing it up and using it to humiliate me even now seems deeply unfair. I've been trying to move on, to grow, to prove that I'm no longer the person I was back then. But they seem unable to let it go. It's as if no matter how much I progress, they are determined to keep me chained to my mistakes. After my mother's biting comment, I no longer had the energy to continue arguing. I remained silent for the rest of the dinner while my parents continued talking. The topic of their conversation shifted to my sister, Serena, the exemplary daughter. They bragged about how well she was doing in life, how all her teachers adored her, and how she always won awards. Hearing their praise was like feeling a stab in the chest. It wasn't that I envied Serena, she deserved every one of her achievements, but it was painfully obvious that my parents reserved all their pride and affection only for her, while they treated me as if I was worthless. When dinner came to an end, I understood that there was no point in telling them about the gift I had planned. I had been so excited to give them something special, to show them that I could take care of them, that I wasn't the failure they always seemed to believe I was. But after the way they treated me, I was furious. I also knew they wouldn't value my gift. At first, I considered canceling my reservation since I wasn't giving it to my parents. But now that I've thought it over, I've decided to use it for myself and take a friend. I'm a jerk for not giving the gift to my parents and using it for myself instead, just because I'm upset. Update 1. Thanks to everyone for your advice. Since I can't reply to every comment, I would like to give a more detailed explanation of why I behaved the way I did, and why it's no longer something I do. And that's precisely why it hurts so much that my parents aren't able to understand my perspective or trust me. My behavior back then had a lot to do with the loss of my grandparents. For the first 8 years of my life, I lived with them while my parents were in another city completely occupied with their business. My grandparents were my whole world during that time. Obviously, I knew who my parents were, but I rarely saw them. My father was always busy with work and didn't have the time or resources to visit me frequently. I grew up with phone calls and brief visits instead of the real presence of my own parents. My grandparents, whom I affectionately called Nana and Paps, were more like my parents than my own biological parents. During those years, they were my guides, my caregivers, and my source of love and stability. When my parents finally returned home, they didn't arrive alone. They brought my younger sister, Serena, with them. Once they settled here, they actually forced me to move in with them, and I hated it. Suddenly, I was expected to adapt to a new family dynamic with 2 people I barely knew and a sister who, in my eyes, seemed to have replaced me in their lives. Don't get me wrong, I understand that my parents wanted us to be a family, and they probably thought it was best for me to move in with them. But from my perspective, my life changed from one moment to the next, and I was the only one who had to adjust while they continued as if everything was normal. The transition wasn't easy for me at all. With my grandparents, my life had a comforting rhythm. I had my own room, my own routines, and a sense of stability that I valued greatly. Moving in with my parents was like entering a completely different world. My room became a small space shared with Serena. She and I had never met before, so there was no bond between us. Because of all the years we spent apart, she didn't know me, and I didn't know her, which resulted in constant fights. Then there was my father. He wasn't an easy man to live with. My grandparents always treated each other with respect, and they raised me in a peaceful and loving environment. But my father had a very bad temper. He would yell and raise his voice at my mother and me for reasons that often seemed non-existent. I was frequently terrified of being near him, and his mere presence kept me in constant tension. My mother wasn't any better. She ignored me all day and rarely sat down to talk to me. As a result, I never felt comfortable with my own parents, and lived as if I was walking on broken glass around them. What made everything worse was the way my parents reacted if I ever dared to complain about how I felt. It was as if they expected me to simply adapt without questioning anything, to completely forget my grandparents, as if the 8 years I spent with them meant nothing. My father, in particular, was extremely strict about this. He demanded that I stop calling my grandfather Paps, saying it was inappropriate and too childish. Instead, I had to refer to him as grandfather, as if a more formal title could erase the bond we had. Because of how attached I was to my grandparents after moving in with my parents, I constantly begged them to visit me on weekends. But my parents didn't like that. They told my grandparents to stop visiting me so often, arguing that I needed to spend time away from them to readjust to my real family, my mom, my dad, and Serena. Naturally, I hated this. To me, it felt like my parents were actively trying to distance me from the only people who truly understood me and whom I truly loved. Gradually, I began to resent my family even more for keeping me separated from my grandparents. And then when I was 14 years old, the unthinkable happened. My grandparents, my Nana and my Paps, died in a car accident. A drunk driver took the 2 most important people in my life. They were my whole world, and in an instant they were gone. The pain was unbearable. As if someone had ripped my heart out of my chest. I wanted to scream until I had no voice left, cry until I couldn't anymore, ask God why He allowed something so cruel and senseless. I felt like my heart was shattered, and I didn't know how to move on. At a time when I needed more support and understanding than ever, My parents weren't there to help me. They did the complete opposite. They refused to see how depressed I was. Instead of giving me space to process my grief, they forced me to get up and go to school every day even though inside I felt like I had no energy left. I was consumed by sadness, struggling to get through one day after another. My grades started to drop because I simply couldn't concentrate. And instead of helping me or showing me compassion, my parents just yelled at me every time report card day arrived, as if yelling at me was going to fix the emptiness I felt inside. I spent most of my time in bed with no strength to do anything. My parents yelled at me for being lazy when it was actually grief and depression that paralyzed me. Even my teacher at school noticed my change in behavior and suggested that I see a grief counselor. But my mother immediately rejected the idea. She insisted that I didn't need a mind doctor to feel better, and that therapy was nothing more than a scam. Looking back, I realize how much I needed professional help at that time. I needed someone to talk to, someone to validate my pain and guide me through the grieving process. But my parents refused to acknowledge how much I was suffering. They left me alone to face a sadness and a loss that overwhelmed me, and that isolation only made everything worse. It's no wonder those feelings festered inside me, becoming the spark that led me down the worst possible path. As a result of everything I was experiencing, the grief, the loneliness, and the resentment toward my parents, my anger turned into destructive decisions. I started hanging out with the wrong people at school, and eventually they introduced me to drugs. Back then I thought it was an escape route, a way to cope with everything I was feeling deep down. However, I knew it was wrong. I shouldn't have gone down that path. But at that moment I desperately wished I had someone, just one person, to sit with me, talk to me as an equal, and help me make sense of my pain. But that never happened. When things got even more out of control, when I started drinking, using drugs, and even stealing money from my mother, my father reached his limit. One day, after finding me high, he slapped me across the face and called me a disgrace. The next day, without hesitation, he sent me to rehab. At the time, I resented him for doing it. But looking back, maybe it was the best thing he did for me. I spent a month in the center, and surprisingly, I didn't hate it. For the first time in a long time, I had a space where I could truly open up, talk about my feelings, and be heard without judgment. That experience changed me. When I left rehab, I felt like a new person. I was able to focus better in school, and eventually I managed to get into a good university. I started building my life, moving away from the person I was during those difficult years. However, despite all my progress and the effort I put into changing my life, my parents never let me forget my mistakes. Not a single day went by without them reminding me how I had shamed the family with my drug and alcohol use. My father, in particular, constantly brought it up. He told me more than once that if I hadn't been his oldest son, he would have kicked me out onto the street without hesitation. My mother wasn't much better. She constantly threatened to disinherit me and cut ties with me forever if I ever used drugs or alcohol again. Those words hurt. Despite all my efforts to redeem myself, I felt like they only saw me as a failure, as the son who had disappointed them. I understand their frustration and pain, but I wish they could have seen the person I was trying to become instead of constantly reminding me of the person I used to be. It's a pain I still carry with me in adulthood. If you're wondering if I ever apologized to my parents, I did. However, it didn't matter how many times I said I was sorry or how much proof I gave them that I had grown and changed, their perception of me never really changed. Even when it came time to go to college, my father refused to pay my tuition, claiming it would be a waste of money to spend it on a drug addict like me. His refusal was despite the fact that he had the means to afford it. I begged him again and again, but he was inflexible. In the end, I had no choice but to apply for student loans to pay for my education. Despite all of that, I never allowed myself to hold a grudge or blame my parents. Yes, they could have handled things differently, but ultimately my decisions were my own. I was the one who chose to use drugs, and I take responsibility for that. I should have found healthier ways to cope with the death of my grandparents instead of using it as an excuse to rebel and shame my family. That was my mistake. Over the years, I have done everything possible to ask for their forgiveness, hoping they would finally leave my past behind, but they never did. For those who wonder why I wanted to give them a gift like this in the first place, knowing how they've treated me, the answer is simple. 3 months ago, I graduated from college. For me, this was a milestone, a personal victory in many ways, as I managed to do it on my own, without the help of my parents. And last month I finally got a position at a good company, a job I worked incredibly hard for. After weeks of exhausting interviews, when I received my first paycheck earlier this month, I burst into tears. After everything I had gone through, after every moment of pain and doubt, I had finally made it. I was finally free. After all the obstacles and mistakes, I was finally earning my own money, and it was more than I had ever imagined. At that moment, my thoughts went to my grandparents. I knew in my heart of hearts that if they were alive, they would be incredibly proud of me. They would have hugged me with the same immense love and unconditional support they always gave me, without expecting anything in return. Their absence left a void in me that is impossible to fill, a bittersweet pain that never completely disappears. But I reminded myself that I still had my parents. Even if our relationship wasn't perfect, I wanted to share my success with my family, to show them that I wasn't the failure they always thought I would be. That despite everything, I had managed to succeed on my own. Update 2. I have decided to use the plane tickets and the resort days for myself, and I'll take a friend. I've received many messages from people asking why I still maintain a relationship with my mother and father despite everything. The answer is simple. I know exactly what it feels like to lose loved ones, and the idea of completely cutting off contact with my parents has always terrified me. When my grandparents passed away, they were my whole world, my only family. Losing both of them in a single night left a scar on me that hasn't fully healed yet. The pain and emptiness of that loss still weigh heavily on me. And just imagining that someday I could also lose my parents or my sister terrifies me to my core. Despite all the difficulties, I love them. They are still my family, and the idea of being without them is unbearable to me. Having said that, I also understand that loving family doesn't mean accepting being mistreated. My parents' actions have hurt me time and time again, and I know it's not healthy to allow that to continue. If they continue to hurt me, if they continue to ignore how I feel, then I will have to distance them from my life, not because I want to, but because I need to. But for now, I will set certain boundaries with them. I also want to clarify something about my sister, Serena. No, I don't hate her. It's true that she is my parents' golden child, and that they have always treated her much better than me. It's no secret. Anyone who knows us can see it. My parents created a bond with her from the moment she was born, while I was sent to live with my grandparents from a young age. As a result, our childhoods were completely different, and that ultimately marked the relationship each of us has with our parents. But despite all of this, Serena and I get along. We're not the closest sisters in the world, but at least we understand each other. She respects me as her older sister, and now that we're adults, we rarely fight. In fact, sometimes she feels bad about the way our parents treat me compared to her, and on some occasions she has even defended me. I appreciate her empathy, and I've never blamed her for our parents' actions. It's not Serena's fault that our parents prefer her, or that they've treated me the way they have. Serena never asked to be the perfect daughter, just as I never had the option of being the black sheep. Update 3. It's been a month since the last time I updated anything here. My sister was the one who sent those photos to my parents. She has apologized to me several times. She told me she was just proud of me, and that she never thought sharing those photos would cause a problem. Her voice sounded genuine, almost regretful, I think. She assured me that she won't do something like that again, and I trust her. In general, Serena has always had good intentions and has sincerely supported me. I know she would never intentionally try to hurt me, so I believe her. Despite all the drama with our parents, Serena agrees with me that distancing ourselves from them was the best decision. She understands that they have hurt me for too long, and that it's not healthy for me to keep allowing them to treat me that way. She has been very empathetic with the whole situation. Lately, my parents have been begging her to talk to me to convince me to unblock them on my phone. They insist that they can fix things between us. Apparently, I'm their favorite daughter now. They keep pressuring Serena to ask me to forgive them. Apparently, after my last conversation with my mother, when I revealed my salary, my parents have been bragging to our relatives about my salary and the company I work for. Suddenly, they've started acting as if they've always been proud of me, as if the years of contempt and humiliation never existed. It's frustrating. This sudden change of attitude feels completely fake. It seems like they only value me now because they can brag about me to others, not because they genuinely care about me or my well-being. It makes me wonder if they've ever really loved me, or if I'm only worth something to them now because I can make them look good in front of others. Clearly, I am no longer the drug-addicted kid they once saw in me, and overnight, I've become someone they consider respectable. It hurts, and at the same time it has opened my eyes. So no matter what they say, no matter how much they try to manipulate me, I'm not going back. I'm not going to buy their love or their respect with my money. Love doesn't work that way, and that's definitely not how I want to be treated. Their toxicity has already caused me enough damage, and I've finally realized that I don't have to keep putting up with it. So from now on I'm clear. I'm going to continue with no contact with them.